Hey y'all, Eric Estep here. I want to welcome you all to the audiobook edition of The Legend of Groovy Hollow. The annual Groovy Hollow iRacing event is all about supporting Extra Life, a Children's Miracle Network Hospitals program. So to thank you all for your generous support over the years, we bring you The Legend of Groovy Hollow, a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. With Tommie out of the car due to an injury, she takes to spending her time at the Ivy Park retirement home caring for Carol Oates, a veteran racer herself. The pair are joined by a surprising new patient at Ivy Park, and Tommie decides to do some investigating.
Chapter 14. There were a number of circumstances that prevented Tommie and her dad from going to the third annual Groovy Hollow 300. The most practical of the reasons was that Tommie had acquired an injury that needed a little bit of surgery to repair. She had broken her leg in a late-model stock car crash at Kingston Speedway back in midsummer, and was still dealing with the fallout. It wasn't the first time she had ever been behind the wheel to compete, but it was the third, and the track decided to reach out and bite her as she crashed into the outside wall near the start-finish line. She was battling Troy Kroger in his family-owned number 77 for Kroger Fam Motorsports for the 13th position. She wasn't having a great run and knew, feeling the leaders breathing down her neck, attempting to put her a lap down. The two young drivers' inexperience was exposed as they tangled on the straightaway and wrecked. Troy didn't walk away unscathed. He was diagnosed with a concussion after further evaluation. But at the time, he was able to walk away without the appearance of serious injury. Tommie wasn't so lucky. She not only felt the bone in her thigh snap, but she also heard it, or thought she did. She couldn't remember exactly, but sitting around at the hospital, she replayed the moment of the incident in her head on a loop, like a movie she couldn't peel her attention away from. In those memories, yes, she could definitely hear the bone snap, and it was a sickening feeling. The pain she remembered less of, though it was certainly there. Needless to say, she needed assistance getting out of the car and into the ambulance. She was rushed to the hospital similarly to Slater and Miss Oates the year before, and went through the whole song and dance of x-rays, diagnosis, MRIs, and an agonizing speech about how long the recovery process was going to be. 4 to 6 months was what the doctor told her was the mean recovery time. And that was for a regular person, less so for an athlete. Since she was a competitor, the process would be more rigorous and could last up to a year for her femur to get back to feeling normal again. Tommie cried at the news. It was the first time she could remember crying since the night of Groovy Hollow 2 when so much was lost and left uncertain. Perhaps a more impractical reason for skipping out on a third edition of the sacred event was entirely based upon superstition. Despite curiosity about what came of the Junkyard Jacks and Bucky Blackwell, along with the constant tease of their return of year 3, Tommie wanted to rid her mind of all that mess. She feared seeing something that she knew she'd never be able to forget, a horrid sight to scar the eyes and mind. The now retired racer Carol Oates lived out the rest of her days at the Ivy Park retirement home. It was the wreck she endured in the second Groovy Hollow 300 that ultimately became the nail in her coffin. She didn't have the energy she once had, nor the drive. Tommie visited her there a couple of times, volunteering as a candy striper in her free time. It was mostly just something to list on her various college applications, though she wasn't entirely sure she even wanted to go to college anymore. She wanted to race and nothing else. But there was a humanitarian aspect to it as well. She felt bad for what had happened to the sweet old woman. Besides that, she was interested in learning about her story. Being an aspiring racer herself, she longed to learn more about other racers' experiences with the business. And as she herself was recuperating from a complex surgical procedure, she figured that this might have been the best opportunity to get to know the racing legend. During her first visit, not a whole lot was said. That first time, she was there strictly as a visitor, not yet taking to the ranks of her future fellow candy stripers. Carol was in and out of consciousness for the 2.5 hours she was there. You can talk to her, honey, but I ain't sure it'll do you much good. I doubt she'll talk back to you. Rochelle, one of her future best work friends, told her before she went into Carol Oates' room for the first time. And Rochelle was right. Other than a few mumbles and grunts, there wasn't much said between them. Tommie did all of the talking that first day. "Hey, Carol," she started somewhat sheepishly. "My name is Tommie Jo Swanson. We've never met, but I'm a huge race fan, and—" That was the only time Tommie saw the old woman react in any sort of way. She winced as a pained expression flashed across her face. Then her right arm flew across the hospital tray over her, knocking over a styrofoam cup of cold ice water. "Crap," Tommie yelped and quickly grabbed some paper towels over the sink to sop up as much of the water as she could. "Sorry," she apologized, but the old woman didn't respond. She seemed to calm down then, sinking inward. Tommie decided then not to say anything else about racing. It was not until she and apparently Carol Oates were ready to talk about it and or hear about it. For the rest of the visit, Tommie just sat there with her and kept her company while Carol labored to breathe. As she was leaving that first visit, she saw a flyer by the front desk of the nursing home. She grabbed it and observed it. It read, "Need volunteer hours for college applications? Consider joining the Ivy Park Home of Recovery. Looks great on any resume. Sign up today." Rochelle noticed her looking at the flyer and said, "You should do it, girl. It's a great experience." Then she leaned in closer. "And some of the male candy stripers ain't too bad looking, if you know what I mean." She nudged her arm and Tommie smiled. "I'll think about it, thank you." And think about it she would. She thought of Carol and the possibility of getting closer to her and figuring out her story. That thought led to so many more residents of Ivy Park just like her, and her heart ached for them. While she was laid up, she figured this would be the perfect opportunity for her to do some good. Give back. When she told Dad about her intentions to join the Candy Stripers, he smiled and said it would be a marvelous idea. "Yeah, that's great, honey," Mom chimed in over dinner. They were chowing down on pot roast with beef, potatoes, and carrots. "It'd be great for a college application. The deadlines are coming up, you know. You've gotten several things in the mail from Carson College over Newport. Maybe it's time to organize an official campus visit." Of all the colleges in the Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia area, Carson College was the one that sent her the most information via snail mail. They were recruiting her hard. In truth, all Tommie knew about the college was that they had sponsored some cars for NASCAR teams in the Cup Series a handful of times in the past, and Liberty sometimes sponsored William Bryan. Beyond that, she didn't know much about colleges and all their complicated ins and outs. "Yeah, maybe," she said, pushing a carrot around her plate. "Who knows, you could be a great pharmacist someday," Mom persisted. "Pharmacist? You're joking, right, Mom?" "No, honey, it would be a great job for you. You clearly care about people and want to make them feel better, what with the Candy Striper application and whatnot." "Maybe it's a good plan B," Tommie admitted, "but still I'd rather be a race car driver." Mom didn't say much after that. She bowed her head and continued poking around at her food. But the way she was prodding illustrated to Tommie that her answer had made her mother lose her appetite. The last thing in the world she wanted to do was disappoint her mother. But Mom thought of things in the practical sense. What profession was more legit and proper for the rest of the world to accept? Driving cars for a living in the local short track circuit was hardly glamorous, not like driving in NASCAR. But even that profession, too, raised some eyebrows at times. When Tommie was younger, being a fan of auto racing or NASCAR was cool. Now, though, it had a reputation more in sync with Nickelback than Green Day. Its legitimacy was always questioned. NASCAR wasn't a real sport in the eyes of many. Not like the NFL, NBA, or NHL, though all those leagues had their own dam of legitimacy problems. What made NASCAR so unique, anyhow? Besides, as she got older, most of the kids in her circles leaned more towards F1 fandom in lieu of NASCAR, despite the fact that Formula One was usually a stinker of a show. Tommie believed that there was a necessary balance between entertainment and athleticism. One with a complete lack of the other often resulted in a traveling circus or dull single-file racing where no one could pass. Dad cleared his throat. Well, college aspirations aside, I think it's a great thing, honey, for you to volunteer at Ivy, don't you, dear? Mom put down her fork and smiled. She wiped the corners of her mouth and said, Why, yes. There was a shockwave of emotion in her voice that Tommie didn't expect. It's a great thing, honey. Excuse me, please. Mom stood up and exited the room. Did I say something wrong? Tommie asked her father. Dad took a deep breath and sighed. He said, No, honey. As long as you spoke your truth and you know without a shadow of a doubt where you want to end up, your answer never would have been wrong. But you have to understand to your mother this being a race car driver was always a pipe dream. Dad must have caught a glimpse of Tommie's flinch at the phrase pipe dream because he quickly reworded. I mean, she thought of your racing thing as a hobby, which I guess is how it started, wouldn't you agree? Dad paused, waiting for Tommie to nod. It was an insulting notion, and she never did. He continued, I think she thought it was sort of surreal. You have to understand, dear, your mom didn't raise you thinking you were going to become some hotshot race car driver. That would have been a ridiculous expectation. Then, once you started testing, and especially once you started competing at a semi-professional level, it was almost like a dream for her. Believe me, Tommie, we've talked about it numerous times, especially after your first race. But then you got hurt. Dad motioned to her leg under the table. And that scared her. She went from being in this dream where you were out racing and talented at it, might I add, but was then pulled back into the harsh reality when you wrecked that this is by no means a safe sport. Not at this level. Really, not at any level. You saw what happened to Carol Oates and Jerry Slater that night, didn't you? Tommie nodded. She thought of the old woman again lying helplessly in her hospital bed. She couldn't wait to talk to her. She never lost faith in the notion that someday the elderly racer would wake up and that the two of them could have a legit conversation. Well, after that happened, your mom was still in that daze. I guess most parents are, or even close friends of racers. They think it just can't happen to them. Racers have to have that attitude going in. I guess family members do too. If they didn't, they'd lose their sanity in grief. This was your first wreck, Tommie, and it won't be the last. It scared your mother, and though I know that you are a racer and that you'll get back in that car, albeit when you're ready, you need to approach your mom and her hesitation to allow you to do so with understanding. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? Tommie nodded again. The message was loud and clear, but even then, Tommie had no desire to do anything but get better and get back in the car. Her racing story was only just beginning. A moment of silence passed between them, the two of them soaking up the conversation. Then Tommie leaned in close. She whispered to her father, There's something else I wanted to talk to you about, Dad, but I didn't want to bring it up in front of Mama. Now, I'm glad I didn't, but Carol Oates, she's in the nursing home. She's in Ivy Park. Dad stared at her in disbelief for a moment, or rather, maybe as if what she had just told him didn't register. He took another bite of his salted beef and potatoes and took a sip from his long-neck glass bottle Mountain Dew. He was buying them by the six-pack by that point. Carol Oates, the racer who got injured over in Groovy Hollow? One of them, yeah, Tommie said, reminding her father that Jerry Slater, too, was injured and in critical condition. Oh, I see. Well, how is she? I think she's doing okay, but that's part of the reason I wanted to volunteer. I wanted to see if she pulled out of it. Tommie nodded. Her father knew her and her macabre tendencies too well. Really, I was hoping that she had a story or two to share. So I can find out more about her, her life, and her career. You're thinking that maybe it will inspire you in some way? Tommie nodded. Right, well, I think it's a great idea. Dad paused a moment to take another bite of his dinner. Then he leaned in real close and whispered, But maybe keep all this on the DL for your mama. She worries about you, kiddo. Tommie nodded her agreement. They each finished their dinner, did the dishes, and then called it a night. Chapter 15. Tommie started her stint as a candy striper at Ivy Park the next week. Rochelle welcomed her with open arms and a big, long bear hug. "Honey, I'm gonna show you all the ropes," she told her. "I'll tell you who's hot, who's not, and who's hot but has too much baggage for a fling to be worth it," she said in a hushed tone. Tommie silently agreed to the plan, but where she really wanted to go instead was to visit the sickly Carol Oates. The first day volunteering at Ivy Park was much like her first visit. No response from Carol other than a few grunts, some inconclusive nods, and some sporadic farts. Her schedule was 3 days a week. She was on her feet for much of the day, but was given permission to break as frequently as she needed to whenever her bum leg started to bother her. Luckily for Tommie, she had always had a big threshold for pain. The unresponsiveness of Carol Oates, which ultimately resulted in Tommie just talking to the wall about racing, went on for about a month. That month was long and stagnant, seemingly never-ending. Then, by the grace of God, the elderly woman showed some promising signs. Increased brain activity was one of them, particularly when Tommie was in the room and trying to interact with her. To the doctor's insistence, Tommie's visits to the Oates room became more frequent, which sparked more brain activity. Then, after about 6 weeks of only small but steady progress, Oates took a big leap for the better. For the first time since the incident, she opened her eyes and looked around. It was another 2 weeks for her to get her voice back, and when it returned, it was raspy. But at last, the two of them could communicate, and that filled Tommie with joy as she had never felt before, falling just shy of the thrill of sitting behind the wheel of her late-model stock. Maybe something in the medical field, or maybe even the caretaker field, wouldn't be such a mismatch for her after all. Still, it never would become her primary focus. That was and always would be on getting her racing career up and off the ground. In their first couple of conversations, not much was spoken about the ins and outs of the racing profession. They were racing adjacent. She wanted to know what had happened to her and needed to be reminded of it often. But the subject was hardly the focus of their talks. Rather, Carol Oates was more interested in talking about the dreams she had while she was under her recurring nightmares. There was one in particular that stuck out to Tommie the most. In the dream, Carol said that she was in the starting lineup of the first ever Groovy Hollow 300. Everyone smiles and the stands are packed. Fans are cheering, the flashes of their cameras twinkling like a sea of stars. That detail was how Tommie knew that, in her mind, some of the facts muddied. Cameras with flashes were outdated when it came to being used by the general public. That and the fact that Carol didn't compete in the first Groovy Hollow 300 but the second. Carol teared up when she recounted the events of the dream. The atmosphere and excitement in the air, as she described, was unreal. She said that it was enthralling, in a way, but there was something else underneath it. A sense of unease that lurked like a shark skimming shallow waters. I chalked it up to nerves, No matter how many times you get behind the wheel, those butterflies in your stomach never fully leave. When you haven't done it in a while, the flittering of those winged wonders intensifies. Even in the dream, I knew it had been a while since I had been in the car, but I never retired. I guess I still haven't. Instead, racing retired me. There was a sense of sadness and clarity in that sentence. Carol Oates smiled and blinked away a small forming puddle of tears. But what any racer wants is just one final race or one final season to do what you've always known and sort of say thank you to the fans who stuck by you and made this sport so great. I quit driving when my daddy took sick. It was a really bad and very slow demise. The disease that doctors couldn't even figure out, and I just referred to as the grip. Chiseled him away inch by painful inch. Shortly after his passing, Mama took ill, too. She hung around a little longer than Daddy, but I think that had more to do with her own stubbornness than anything. Stubbornness is genetic sometimes, kid. I thought I was done with racing, kid. I really did. I won't say that sometimes I didn't get the itch, but that'd be a fib. But the more removed I was from it, the more peace I made with the fact that I was done and I was okay with being done. But when they brought back Groovy Hollow, I just knew I had to give it a shot, and that would be my last race. I turned out to be right, didn't I? There was a brief pause for Carol to cough up some phlegm into a wadded-up tissue. She squeezed it in her hand. I wasn't able to do it that first year. I'm glad of that, to be honest. But I'm not sure it would have mattered either way. I was sick. I've been sick for some time, breast cancer. I had it for about 2 years. I thought I was done for, but miraculously, the week of the inaugural Groovy Hollow 300, it went into remission. I was relieved, as were my doctors and my family. But more than that, I was determined again. I decided right then and there that I was going to be back behind the wheel. I took the next year to rest up, get my head right, and my body. The chemo had taken almost everything from me physically and mentally, and I was at my wit's end. I was sick and tired for most of those 2 years, and I was tired of being sick and tired. I decided to kick those feelings, that pain, right out the door. The only problem standing in my way was that I hadn't been behind the wheel in a while. It had been a long time since I had done it, and to say that I was nervous would be an understatement. I watched that first race back. Had to have a little bit of help from Harold, my nephew. He's a computer science major over at Virginia Highlands in Abington. Such a smart young man, and handsome, too. I tell him all the time how shocked I am that he doesn't have girls hanging all over him. But for Harold, his studies always come first. You and I respect that, right? Tommie stared at her with a blank expression which illustrated her confusion. Carol further explained. Racing. That's what's going on up here almost all the time. The old woman pointed at her wrinkled forehead between her brows and gave it a gentle double tap. We're consumed with it almost. I think a lot of people are passionate about what they do, whether it be racing or studies or something creative like writing or painting. You almost run a risk of those things becoming your whole identity. But secretly, I think we're fine with that. Regular people, they might not understand it, and that'll bug us. You're a racer, miss, and a young one at that. You have a lot of roads still to run in front of you. You're just momentarily parked in the garage. And something to learn and understand early is that even those closest to you will never understand you. Not really. They might posture like they do, but it's just posturing, theatrics. In truth, you're a mystery to them. So am I, and anyone who chooses a profession or even a hobby and becomes enthralled with it. Tommie nodded. She thought of her mother. If what Carol was saying were true, her mother would never understand her wants and dreams. That was a sad reality to grasp, but Tommie understood it and took that disappointment in stride. Carol Oates winced and shifted uncomfortably. Miss, would you be a doll and ask the doctor if I could get my next dose of pain meds? I think it may be a bit early, Miss Oates, Tommie reminded her. Carol waved her off. Call me Carol, please, dear, and your name is... Tommie. Tommie, Oates said and closed her eyes. Her brow furrowed. She was clearly hurting quite substantially. Yeah, Tommie, spelled with an I-E at the end. Carol Oates smiled through her discomfort. She nodded. Right, well, Tommie, could you please leave me? I don't mean to be rude, dear, but I'm a bit talked out at the moment. I think I just need to rest my eyes. Sure, no problem, Tommie said, gathering all her supplies and clearing off the old woman's tray. She carried the trash to the metal can in the corner and started to leave. She turned to tell Miss Oates that she would ask the doctor about her pain meds. But before she could beg her question, the old woman was asleep and snoring. Tommie left the room and shut the door lightly behind her, leaving the woman to dream of better days.
Thanks for listening, folks. We'll be back with more Legend of Groovy Hollow in just a moment. All right, gang, we're back. Let's return now to the Legend of Groovy Hollow.
Chapter 16. Carol Oates didn't mention Bucky Blackwell or even allude to him again until 3 weeks later. Their conversations in the meantime were brief and sporadic. For a while there, the old woman wasn't in much of a talking mood. She was either in too much pain or simply too tired to carry on much of a conversation. Even in those short bursts of interaction between them, Carol mostly lamented how things used to be. When gas was only cents on the gallon, bread was only a quarter. The general cost of living was cheaper and life itself was simpler. In the world of racing, they talked mostly about NASCAR. Clearly, she wasn't a huge fan of the NASCAR playoff system or its various stage racing gimmicks. She loathed drivers of the newer order and clamored for the bloodline drivers such as Chase Elliott and, back when he raced, Dale Earnhardt Jr. At the mention of Junebug's name, Tommie's ears perked up. She talked about watching his second Daytona 500 victory with her dad a decade ago and what a huge deal it was that he won. "Of course it was a huge deal," Oates exclaimed. "He won NASCAR's most popular at the time. And the sport can only truly thrive when the most popular figure in the sport is performing well. He sort of fell off a cliff for a while there, didn't he? Those were dark years for NASCAR." "Yeah," Tommie agreed. While she knew she and Carol didn't agree on everything. For instance, Tommie somewhat liked the NASCAR playoffs, but understood the criticism. She could see where the old veteran racer was coming from. "What do you think about the new car?" Carol shook her head. "Don't care for it. It takes too much out of the driver's hands. It's now about the building of a perfect racing machine rather than about talent or skill. Well, that ain't racing. I say most of the short-track racers nowadays are better race car drivers than some of the big boys in NASCAR. A lot of them are only there because their daddy had deep pockets or something. It's a money game now, and I detest that. Some drivers, or even executives in the industry, thumb their noses down at local short-trackers, whether on asphalt or dirt. But I'll tell you this. American short-track racing is the most modest and honest racing alive today. That's not to say that corruption doesn't happen. It does. It happens everywhere and everything. That's another thing that's gotten worse over time, but is more honest. That's all I'm saying." Carol took a moment's pause from her rant to take a bite from her tray. Today on the menu were turkey slices and instant mashed potatoes drowning in a pool of brown gravy. She chewed and groaned, unsatisfied. "Tastes like crap. Tommie, could you be a dear and see if there's some salt somewhere?" "I doubt the cafeteria will let you have salt, Carol." "True, but I bet they'll let you have some if you ask for it. You're young. They don't think they have the right to suck all the flavor out of your food like they do me. You don't have to tell them that it's for me." Tommie nodded and did what she was told. She went to the cafeteria and asked the manager for a packet of salt. After a brief glance of distrust, she handed Tommie some packaged silverware. Inside the thin plastic wrapper was a plastic fork, a plastic knife, a single napkin, and a small rectangular dual packet of salt and pepper. Tommie took it back to the old woman, unwrapped it, and forked it over. "Yes, thank you, dear." Carol opened the salt and dumped it liberally over her turkey slice. Then she spiced up her potatoes with the black pepper. She took a couple of bites before smacking and licking her lips. Now that's much better. Thank you again, dear. Now, where was I?" Tommie shrugged her shoulders. She couldn't remember herself for her life. While she was interested in what the elderly racer had to say about the current state of the highest form of her profession, she had heard that whole song and dance before. Search it on YouTube and you'll find a plethora of videos denouncing the NASCAR playoffs, and even a few defending them or explaining how they would tweak them. "Doesn't matter anyway, I reckon." Oates exhaled and seemed to deflate. She struck Tommie as thinner and more frail than before. She moved noticeably slower, too. Tommie glanced up at the clock over the door. Noon had come and gone, and it was around the time it was typical for the wind to be sucked out of the old woman's sails. She was getting tired now, and she yawned. She glanced down at her tray almost mournfully. "I only ate half of this. It tastes so much better now. Has more flavor, and I'm not sure I can eat another bite. Would you like it, Tommie?" Tommie shook her head. "No, thank you, but I'm not allowed to." Carol waved her hands in the air dismissively. Right. Well, very well then. You probably don't want the slop anyhow. Why don't you go out and get a good burger? A burger and some fries, maybe, and a strawberry shake. Oh, what I wouldn't give." A sadness came over Oates then, and she seemed to shrink even further. Before long, she had drifted away again, and the snoring would soon commence. Tommie cleaned her up, threw away the uneaten food, and left her for the day. By the time Tommie and Carol were mutually ready to discuss Bucky Blackwell and what had happened the first 2 years the Groovy Hollow 300 was run, there was a noticeable leap in the old woman's stamina. She didn't tire as easily and seemed sharper, perhaps getting back to the relative sharpness she allegedly had before her crash. It was Tommie who initially brought it up one early afternoon. Carol had just finished her lunch, and she could eat around 3/4 of it, a huge improvement, and was watching TV. Practice was on from New Hampshire Motor Speedway. "I remember when Adam Petty was killed there." Her voice shook slightly. "Such a sad day. He had such promise, just like his granddaddy." "Carol, can I ask you a question?" was how Tommie started it. "Yeah, go ahead," she said, taking a sip of her juice. It was a blend of orange and pineapple, Tommie believed. "What made you want to return to racing? Specifically, I mean, the Groovy Hollow 300. What gave you the itch?" "Oh, Tommie, you're a racer. The itch never goes away. You'll find that out when you get older and that nagging voice in the back of your head prompts you to call it a career. That the time is right. But there's another voice, too, and it's even more persistent. The ones that stubbornly tell you that you ain't done yet. It's the one you want to listen to the most. Maturity is knowing when to ignore it, but I didn't ignore it. Didn't we go over this story before?" "You started, I believe, Carol, but we didn't really get into it." See, okay, we can go over that if you want. I had heard about the event. I was, unbeknownst to me, just getting over my cancer at the time. My nephew Harold came over and hooked the whole thing up. I know nothing about the internet, Tommie. I don't know how it works. I don't even really know what it is. I don't know how to use it. I needed his expertise. So he came over and got me all hooked up. I didn't know you could plug up a laptop into a TV with one of those HD cable thingies. He explained that most people have smart TVs, whatever that means. I've always been a bit wary about all that mess, Tommie. It scares me in a way. And sometimes I'm afraid that the human race is starting to get a little too big for its britches in terms of technology and all its advancements. But what does it matter? This world was spinning before I came into it, and it'll continue spinning long after I'm gone. Life will always revolve. That's the way it is. We all adore our toys until they grow stale and something newer and better comes along." Her voice dried and started to feel a little raspy. "Tommie, could you fetch me a glass of water, chilled if they have it?" "Sure." Tommie stood up and headed for the cafeteria. She returned with a medium-sized styrofoam cup full of ice water. She handed it to the elderly racer. Carol Oates sucked at the water, making a high-pitched kissing sound. She smacked her lips, refreshed. "Much better. Thank you, dear. Where was I? Yes, Harold got it fixed up where I could watch the race." Harold had never been much of a race fan. I took him over to Bristol a couple times in spite of my sister's protests. He enjoyed the atmosphere more than anything. NASCAR fans really know how to tailgate. But once the engine started, he covered his ears and cried, especially the first time, because he wanted to go home. Even the last time I took him when he was a teenager in high school, he went with these big headphones on. I glanced over at his iPod gadget. He was listening to Kiss while chatting up some girl. Not once did he ever look up at the action or pay it any mind other than to treat it as an annoyance. But he was good enough to hook me up so I could watch Groovy Hollow, so there's that. He said, "And Carol, here's how you disconnect and get back over to your cable box." Yes, I know that cable is out of style these days, but I don't get that whole streaming nonsense. Who needs Netflix or that Lulu or whatever in the beans you call it? Give me my charter cable and I'm a happy camper. I just want to be able to watch Blue Bloods as it airs. That and, of course, NASCAR when it's on and football when it isn't. He did something to his computer to show it to me. I can't even begin to tell you what he did. Either I don't remember it or I just didn't understand it. Maybe even simultaneously likely. I just told him that I'd leave it as is and he could come over and disconnect it the next day. I told him that I'd probably turn it in after the race anyway, and I did, though I couldn't sleep. Harold left and I got to watch the thing. I was surprised at how detailed it all was, production quality-wise, considering it was something airing over the internet. I guess the internet really has caught up with cable television. But I'm a stickler. Always will be. Have to accept it at this point. but I didn't enjoy the race as much as I was hoping to. Don't get me wrong, it was great excitement. The announcers were entertaining and funny at times. What spoiled it all for me was, well, his return. Who? Bucky Blackwell? Carol's complexion went fish-belly white. She looked as if she had seen a ghost. Yeah, him in that blasted car of his. You know, after he quote-unquote disappeared, I tried to find his car. I've always been fascinated with local lore, not ghost stories. Those always gave me the heebie-jeebies, just unsolved mysteries, things with a logical explanation, not things to make your hair stand up on the back of your neck as you sit around a campfire. Though I admit that sometimes those two things can overlap. That's usually when I drop it. You see, I didn't believe the stories that the track just up and disappeared along with Blackwell as his infamous Halloween machine. It all seemed very too fantastical for my taste. And I was sure that somewhere somebody knew who and where Blackwell was and where he stashed his car. Blackwell, he wasn't a nice man. He had his hands in some bad cookie jars, to say the least. Racing was his side gig. I didn't know that he loved racing. So many of us love the sport, we even bleed it. I know you're the same way, Tommie. You eat, breathe, and bleed this sort of stuff. Bucky Blackwell, he was a different animal altogether. And the word animal is used only a little loosely. He loved to win. I think that was really all he cared about, not the camaraderie of the sport or the sportsmanship angle of it. He liked winning, and not just barely by a nose. He liked stomping his competition. Needless to say, I never tracked down his Halloween machine during his absence. Clearly, he still has it. I guess he had it all this time. But what bothered me the most about that night in particular was the circumstances in which he got into that race 2 years ago. 80 cars showed up to qualify. Blackwell's 31 wasn't one of them. Instead, it was a man named Jerry Slater who looked a little worse for wear. You were there, weren't you, Tommie? You know what I'm talking about. Tommie nodded. He looked sick, she confirmed and sat down, her elbows propped up at her knees as she took in this miraculous lady's story. He looked like death, Carol emphasized. But you saw that he looked off. Good, keep that in mind. Then right before the opening ceremonies were about to begin, he collapsed. And amidst all that chaos, who came strutting in to take his slot in the race? Bucky Blackwell. You got that right, Blackwell. Now, if the whole mess didn't already look suspicious enough, Blackwell, the famed driver rumored to have gone missing during the last ever race held at Groovy Hollow, pounced on the opportunity of a withdrawn car. Then, as Slater's team was wheeling his car out of the track, Blackwell drove at them and stopped. They exchanged words. Nobody knows for sure what was said or discussed. Nobody except Bucky and Jerry's crew, that is. Seems a little too organized, a little too coincidental. What are you suggesting? Tommie asked. That Jerry Slater was drugged or something? Carol pointed a finger at her and narrowed her eyes. What I'm suggesting is that something ain't right with those two. We saw it that first night, but I don't know. I didn't think much about it, I guess. We were so shocked and in complete disbelief over Jerry's sudden medical emergency that the suspicion of it all was just sort of glazed over. Maybe that was by design. Regardless, I think something bad happened to Jerry that night, and I think Bucky Blackwell and his crew knew about it and were responsible for it. Tommie's head was spinning now. She had her own suspicions, but never vocalized them before. She didn't want to run the risk of sounding like a conspiracy quack. But hearing Carol say very similar things out loud made her feel a little less alone, as if she could be open with her thoughts on the matter and not have to hide from it due to its improbabilities. What do you make of his disappearance after the race, Bucky, I mean? Carol flashed her a curious smile then. What might you think of it, Tommie? To be honest, I've no idea. The whole thing seems so impossible. Yes, but you saw it with your own eyes. Carol and Tommie shared a knowing glare within which so much was said. Yeah. Curious, ain't it, Tommie Swanson? It was. I think Bucky has tapped into something bad, and it has ties with the track, that's what I think. But the specifics of it, I don't know, but I sure would love to find out. The two sat in silence the rest of the day. Carol watched the news before falling asleep. Tommie took out her trash, wiped her mouth, and left the room as quietly as a mouse. Chapter 17. It was a week or so later when Jerry Slater himself, the man, the myth, the legend, was admitted to Ivy Park. He got a room to himself, closed off from the rest of the world. He entered the facility silently. So silently that neither Tommie nor Carol knew of his arrival until toward the end of Tommie's shift that day. She knew that something was going on, but something almost always was. There was a lot of commotion around Jerry in the room that housed him. A lot of doctors in and out, a lot of nurses. But that was hardly a rarity when it came to new patients, especially new patients with traumatic injuries as severe as Jerry's. Tommie was on her way to fetch Carol a cup of ice when out of the corner of her eye she spotted him. At first, it didn't register fully. She knew she recognized the crippled man, but the name didn't appear to her instantly. Rather, she was met with a severe case of acid reflux and anxiety she couldn't explain. As Carol munched on her ice chips, Tommie mulled over the situation in the room 3 doors down. She thought of the man and how familiar he looked. She did that for about an hour before it finally hit her that Jerry Slater was the newest guest house at Ivy Park. "Jerry Slater!" Tommie cried. Carol was startled. She shook slightly, spilling some of her ice chips from her cup. "What's that?" "There's a new patient at Ivy Park." "I know," Carol said warily. She narrowed her vision, interested in where Tommie was going with it, but afraid all the same. "I've seen the doctors rush by. They didn't pay me no mind. There must have been something serious." "Yes, and it's him, Carol. It's Jerry. He's in the room 3 doors down." Carol batted her arm through the air dismissively. "Can't be." "Why not? Jerry crashed the same night you did and was sent to the hospital." "Yeah, but Jerry's young. His body would have recovered from his injuries a lot faster than mine. He was probably released and back at home. Whoever you saw down there is someone else. Maybe a doppelganger or something." "No, Carol, I'm telling you that it's him. It's Jerry to a T. What if his injuries were more severe than either of us thought?" Tommie felt foolish then. After the second annual Groovy Hollow event, she did a little research into Jerry and his whereabouts. She was focused primarily on Carol, likely feeling similarly to how she did, that he'd heal quick and much more easily than she would. But she thought back to his head-on collision with the wall. It was a hard hit, and she felt stupid for not considering that he could have been really, really hurt. Carol fell silent, considering this. Then she kicked her covers off of her and swung around, dangling her feet off the edge of the bed. "What are you doing?" Tommie asked, rushing over to the bed and holding out her arms just in case the old woman were to topple over. "I'm going to go see it for myself. Be a lamb and fetch my walker, Tommie. It's folded up and stored in the wardrobe." Tommie had never seen Carol out of her bed before. She knew that the old woman wasn't strictly bedbound. She received physical therapy services twice a week, but she was always out of the room when Carol was being worked on. She hurried over to the wardrobe and opened it. The nostalgic cinnamon scent of the elderly brought back nostalgic memories of when she used to visit Grandma Bonnie when she was younger. She hadn't thought about Granny Bonnie in a long time. She passed away from a brain aneurysm a while ago, and Tommie's mom deemed her too young to attend the funeral. To this day, she doesn't like funerals. They were scary affairs that were best avoided at all possible costs. As she fished out the walker, unfolded it, and carried it over to Carol, she asked, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Carol waved her off like she tended to do. "The physical therapist told me I needed to be more active. On most days, I'm too worn out to leave this bed, but I think I need to get some steps under my belt if I ever have a prayer of getting out of here." Guided by Tommie, Carol attempted to get out of the bed but fell back down. She repeated the attempt, only to find the same result. She murmured some words under her breath, and Tommie could tell by the nature of their hissing sounds that the old woman was beating herself up, perhaps a little too aggressively. On the third attempt, she stood. She wavered off balance, and Tommie moved closer so she could catch her if she started to go down. But after a few seconds, Carol steadied herself. She leaned forward, grabbed at the rubber grips on the walker's handles. Shoot. Come on now, Tommy, take me for a walk. We'll cruise right by Slater's room if it is indeed him. Then we'll know a little something potentially about his condition. Tommy hooked the old woman by the arm and led her out into the hall. Chapter 18. Something's the matter with him, Carol Oates said with a labored breath. Tommy was standing beside her, fluffing her pillow and helping her get resettled in bed. It was a nice short walk, a definite step in the right direction for the old woman's recovery. Carol tired quickly. They didn't even make it halfway down the hall when the goal, at least in Tommy's mind, was to get all the way to the front desk before heading back to the room. They did, however, stroll by Jerry Slater's room. His identity was confirmed as the name was written on the dry erase board on the door. Seeing him sparked something grim inside Carol. She knew instantly that he was in dire straits. Well, obviously, Tommy agreed as she pulled the blankets back up on the old woman, and she continued squirming to get settled. He had a bad wreck. Yes, but that ain't what I'm talking about. What are you talking about then? Carol took in a deep breath and let out a long drag. There's something off, Tommy. Or is it just me? You know, sometimes I have a hard time telling if anyone else can. I don't know, but I sense when something's clearly amiss, like I can. Tommy readied herself to respond, but a double knock came on the door. Slowly, the door crept open. It was a nurse, and she was there to deliver Carol's medicine. Good afternoon, Carol. How's my favorite patient today? Carol flashed Tommy a "we'll talk later" glare before taking another labored breath and saying, I have my good days and my bad ones. It's more or less a 50-50 split at this point. I hope you brought me something good this time and not that other crap you've been giving me. That stuff doesn't help the pain. Nurse Hillary flashed Carol and Tommy an apologetic smile. Sorry, same stuff. Doctor's orders. Well, you can tell that Dr. Retzlaff that this ain't working. I'm in a great deal of pain, and I need him to update my dosage like yesterday. Nurse Hillary nodded and said, I'll relay that message. She then turned to Tommy. Do you mind giving us just a second? Sure, Tommy said. I'll be back, Carol, after you take your meds, okay? Carol waved her off. Tommy left the room and waited outside in the hall for a couple of minutes before the nurse came out. She'll be out pretty soon, say about 20 minutes. Tommy nodded. She was a little feisty. Has she been that way all day? All day, all week, all year. Her whole life, Tommy said with a smile. Nurse Hillary laughed at this. Well, she kept prodding me about the new patient, Mr. Slater? Jerry Slater? Yes, that's him. Did the two of you know him or something? Know of him is more accurate. Is he? He ain't out of the woods, that's all I can tell you. I don't know any of the specifics, just as I told her. She nodded her head towards Carol's room. Then she started down the hall, eager to get to her next task before calling it a shift. Tommy slipped back inside the room. Already she had seen a change in Carol's mood and demeanor. She seemed to shrink in her bed, looking just generally exhausted. Her eyelids sagged and blinked as she struggled to stay awake, and her mouth went slack. She looked over at Tommy as she sat down in the armchair in the corner of the room. I think I only have a few minutes, Tommy, before I go under. 20 minutes, my butt. It's hitting you hard? Carol made a strange sound that was almost akin to a laugh. Harder than the outside wall. Tommy winced at the statement, but ultimately dismissed it, knowing she wasn't in her right mind. If anything, her thoughts were cloudy, and the previously bright and shiny day in her head was fixing to turn to night. I heard that Nurse Hillary gave you some insight on Slater. She smiled sleepily. Just sort of the cliff notes, Tommy. Nothing in too excruciating detail. He was over at the hospital, Franklin Woods Memorial, I think. Initially, he was in the ICU, but was eventually pulled out. Carol paused then and yawned hugely. The meds, they're hitting me badly. Anywho, he was in the ICU for about a month, maybe a little more. He was in a medically induced coma that first week, Tommie learned. Then they brought him out of it. He started to improve, so they took him out of the ICU. He seemed to be on the mend, making strides in a short time. They thought he'd be released ages ago and back at home on the road to making a full recovery. But that didn't happen. About a week prior to his scheduled discharge, he took a turn for the worse. The nurse said that he had stopped eating and felt unresponsive. Brain activity took a nosedive, too. They said that he wasn't brain dead, that there was a few pulses firing off up there, but he still hasn't responded since falling under. They moved him here so that his family could see that he was taken care of. I guess the hospital was overcrowded. Carol paused to yawn again. Her eyes shut entirely at that time as she grew weary of fighting them to stay open. He's in his family's hands now, his daughter in particular. I didn't even know he had a daughter. Apparently, she moved to Tampa some number of years ago. I don't think they talk too awful much. She felt completely silent then. Within seconds, she was sawing logs. Tommie went over to her, tucked her in, and left her old mentor to her dreams. Chapter 19. Jerry Slater passed away the following Saturday. He was not alone. His daughter, who ultimately decided to pull the plug, was with him. On TV, the playoff cutoff race at Daytona was showing. The plug was pulled shortly after the conclusion of the race. Carol knew that something bad had happened. She was watching the race, too, and was annoyed by the constant hustle and bustle in the hall outside. She asked Nurse Richard a couple of times if she could have her door shut, but he declined. "Sorry, the door must be open for now, darlin'." "Well, what the heck is going on out there?" she asked. Nurse Richard shrugged. "I don't know, I just got here. Are you done with your dinner?" She was, having just pushed around at the hospital cafeteria mush with her plastic fork. She pushed the tray away from her and folded her arms. Nurse Richard sighed and took her tray. "You can stay up just a little while longer. I'll be back shortly for lights out, okay?" Carol reluctantly nodded, and Richard left. The medication hadn't gotten to her as much that night, and that she was thankful for. She waited a minute long enough for Richard to hurry down towards the cafeteria, and then she threw her covers off. She would go check out and see what all the hubbub was about. She needed to do some walking anyway, if only to tell the physical therapist that she at least attempted to get her exercises in. It took her a few attempts to get off the bed so that she could walk unstably over to the wardrobe. Once she did, though, she took each wobbly step carefully and slowly. The last thing in the world she needed was to experience a fall. That would only set her recovery back all the further if she was ever able to recover in the first place. She opened the elongated door of the wardrobe and gingerly removed the walker from inside. With a slight struggle, she opened it up and placed it in front of her. She squeezed the cushioned rubber handles and slowly exited the room, turning right and heading straight for Slater's room. Carol got a brief glimpse through the small sliver of an opening in the cracked door. She could no longer see his face. The white bedsheets covered it as they started disconnecting him from the various machines that worked hard to prolong his life. "He passed!" Carol screamed inside with alarm. She almost wanted to go in there to poke her nose where she knew it didn't belong. Nurse Richard stopped her. "Carol, what are you doing out of bed?" Carol looked up. The big hulk of a man stood halfway down the hallway. He started toward her, walking with a purpose. "I'm going back," Carol called and turned, heading back for her own room. Before she could reach the door, however, Nurse Richard was already on her. He quickly ushered her in and helped her back into bed. "Lights out now, Carol," he told her. After she got settled in bed, he reached over and clicked the lights off. The room plunged into darkness. Once he was gone, Carol reached for her phone. She went to contacts and found Tommie's name. She clicked it and then hit text, just as Tommie had shown her to do. From there, she relayed her message. "Jerry Slater is dead. Call me tomorrow." Dad found Tommie in her room. She was crying, having read Carol's text. She tossed her phone onto the nightstand a little too hard, and it skidded off the surface and clattered against the wall. She buried herself in her pillow as she listened to her dad hastily climbing the stairs and gently knocking on the door. He opened it just a crack and poked his nose in. "Tommie, are you all right? I heard a—" "I'm fine," Tommie said, trying to piece together her wavering voice. She sniffed and wiped her nose into her pillowcase. Dad hesitated a moment. Tommie almost felt it, then he sheepishly asked, "Can I come in?" Tommie didn't answer. In truth, she wanted him there, but she didn't at the same time. Tommie and her dad had a very close bond, which was apparent even when she was the youngest. She was always described as a daddy's girl. Their shared interest in racing in fast cars only strengthened their bond. But at the same time, she was raised to be a race car driver, and race car drivers had to be tough. If they cry, they don't show it. As a racer or an athlete in any sport, Tommie imagined, it was important to psych your opponents out. You're always in the best position when you go toe-to-toe against someone who can't decipher your thoughts. That's when you're the most dangerous behind the wheel. That was a driver at their most intimidating. Sometimes that attitude can leak into real life as well, and though it can often be interpreted as coolness or a lack of affection, it was really done out of fear of losing that valuable edge. Tommie and her dad had a great relationship. Tommie knew that and could see it every day. Every girl in the world could only wish that they were as lucky as she was. Still, he was also part of that racing world, and a small part of her, a minuscule but still present part, feared that he would somehow look down on her for showing her emotions and wearing them on her sleeve. It was a ridiculous notion, sure, but one she felt nonetheless. It seemed as legitimate as anything else in the world. He took her non-answer as consent and hesitantly walked in. He left the door open, and the light from the hall ate away in the surrounding darkness of her bedroom. "Tommie, what's the matter?" Dad asked. Again, she didn't respond. He walked slowly over to her and sat down at the foot of the bed. The way the mattress dipped brought all those emotions out, and Tommie started to sob into her pillow. Hey, come on," Dad said, reaching out to shake her on the shoulder. "Whatever it is, it can't be that—" He paused a moment and let her go. He withdrew and fell unsettlingly quiet. Then he asked, "Oh, honey, is it Carol? Is she—" He trailed off, afraid to finish the sentence. The notion that it could have been Carol who passed and not Jerry filled Tommie with unfathomable anguish. It was a fictitious notion, after all. Carol was still alive and as feisty as ever. And yet, just thinking about the possibility of her death sent dark daydreams trouncing through Tommie's head. It was like she really had lost her, as little as that made sense even to Tommie. Like she really was dead, and this was her in the future mourning the loss of her new friend. Tommie sat up and wiped away some rogue tears. "No, Carol's fine," Tommie said simply. Dad breathed a sigh of relief. "Oh, good. Then what is wrong? Something has to be, right?" "It's Slater," Tommie said. Saying his name aloud somehow stopped the emotional outburst, if only for the time being. They were silent for a moment. Dad looked away and stared unblinkingly out into space. Though he and Jerry were never friends in the most traditional sense, they were still the same age, classmates. Tommie couldn't even begin to imagine how hard it was to lose somebody, a peer so close to your own age, someone who you had seen at least in passing every day of your youth. When Dad finally spoke, he said, "Slater, Jerry Slater?" He blinked in disbelief. Tommie nodded. "He was checked into Ivy Park about a week ago." "So he was already pretty much in bad shape?" Tommie nodded again. "It wasn't good, Dad. But I heard that he was on amends. I mean, we all knew that he would never race again, but we never would have thought—" The chatter at the hospital was that he took a turn for the worst. He was on the path to recovery, and then all of a sudden— Tommie didn't finish the explanation. She didn't have to. Dad nodded his understanding. He stood up, wiped his own eyes, and cleared his throat. "Well, that's unfortunate for sure. It's late, Tommie. Let's turn in. We can talk about all of this tomorrow, okay?" "Okay." Dad walked to the door and out into the hall. Before closing the door, he looked back at her and smiled. "Good night, sweetie. Sweet dreams." He closed the door, and the room's darkness regained supreme once again. Tommie tossed and turned throughout the night. Sweet dreams? That was impossible. In the small bursts that Tommie found herself able to sleep, her dreams were nightmarish. Single stills from the most gruesome horror films in her collection. She fell asleep and awoke in horror, sure that she wasn't alone. Rinse and repeat, and before she knew it, the morning sun was rising from the depths of the surrounding forests.
That concludes this episode of The Legend of Groovy Hollow, but there's still more to come. On the next episode of The Legend of Groovy Hollow, racing returns to the haunted track, but Tommie will struggle with her future racing career, if she even has one at all after this. The Legend of Groovy Hollow is a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Groovy Hollow is a production of Out of the Groove, The Daily Downforce, and AE Engine. For more great content like this, visit dailydownforce.com.